Now there were shepherds there. St. Luke wants us to know about these shepherds that were there. Well, contrary to what you may have heard, shepherds were not necessarily dirty, smelly, faithless nomads living on the peripheries of society. They served an important role in ancient times, and notable people like Moses and King David were shepherds. And while it is not known definitively, there is reason to believe that these shepherds, who St. Luke tells us about, who were witnesses at the manger, may have had an important role in Jewish faith life. There is some evidence that the sheep they cared for were special and set aside for the religious sacrifice in the temple. And so because of their vocation, the shepherds were, in many ways, close to this. They were considered unclean and couldn't take part in temple worship without ritual cleansing. And so therefore they weren't close to the temple in location. They were far away from it in true practice. Close, but still distant. They were the kind of people Jesus would eventually interact with in his earthly ministry. We can imagine, too, that out in the fields tending sheep, there was much time to talk and explore their beliefs. And so these shepherds, we might say, although dirty and smelly, were probably as ready to hear the good news of the coming of the Messiah when the angels appeared to them. Their hearts were prepared for the good news that was about to come. Even more importantly, in the gospel passage that will be proclaimed later on this morning at our morning masses, St. Luke tells us that having responded to the angels, the shepherds go to see the Christ child for themselves. And then, in the words of the gospel, the shepherds returned, glorifying and praising God for all they had heard and seen, just as it had been told to them. Having been drawn close, those who were distant now go and proclaim. About a month ago, I received an unsigned letter from someone who I think perhaps in some way resembles the shepherds. It wasn't a typical kind of Christmas letter. It began this way: "Greetings. I live in Massapequa Park and at one time was a regular Sunday 7:30 a.m. Mass attendee. I enjoyed the quiet and ritual of the Mass. Growing up, I was a bad Catholic, but I understood the meaning of love, goodness, forgiveness, and the other tenets of religion without the belief of a God watching over me. Early this morning, around 7 a.m., I was driving west on Hempstead Turnpike after exiting from the Bethpage State Parkway. As I passed the AutoZone store close to St. Joseph's Hospital, I saw a disheveled homeless woman walking east on the westbound side of the turnpike. She was dressed in what appeared to be green surgical scrubs with a brown cotton shirt, shivering from the cold. I had to drop my wife off to babysit for our grandchild. I then returned to Hempstead Turnpike to find the woman on the cement median across from the 7-Eleven store, still shivering, cars passing her by without even a look. I pulled my car over on the side of 7-Eleven. There was a guy in a suit talking on his phone in the parking lot. Nothing from him. He couldn't have missed her. I walked toward her and I asked if she was okay, and shivering, she said yes. I gave her my brown fleece-lined hoodie, and I helped her zip up. In a soft voice, she said, "Thank you. You are very kind. It is very warm." She then apologetically said, "I'm trying to get something to eat." Tears fell from my eyes, and I gave her the $10 bill I had in my pocket, and I wished her well. My despair is that I could do no more, and I still feel guilty. However, my guilt turned to indignation directed at those who drove by unconcerned. They've lost their compassion. This is real life, not a story from a Bible. I'm sure there are others who have done good, hoping it rubs off on others. On Hempstead Turnpike during this morning commute, humanity failed miserably. I told you it wasn't a typical Christmas card, right? But I've kept this letter on my desk, and I was wondering what I was supposed to do with it. And recently I read it again, and something made me think of the shepherds. I left something out of the letter that I just read to you. In the letter, the writer identifies himself as an atheist. I don't believe that to be true, not from what I read in the letter. He said in the past he frequently attended Mass here, and in response to what he witnessed on Hempstead Turnpike, he felt compelled to write to a priest. Like the shepherds, I think that man was close to God, yet still distant. In that woman that he encountered the humble presence of Christ. And that encounter evoked a personal response from him and prompted him to tell me the story. I wish I knew who he was so I could tell him that he encountered Christ on that center median on Hempstead Turnpike. I wish I knew who he was so I could tell him how close he was to God. I don't know who he is. Therefore, I'm telling you, because there are shepherds here. Each of us are at different degrees of being close, yet distant, still from God. We return to this celebration of Christmas each and every year because we're summoned here by the grace of God through the church, through the saints and the angels. We who have been out in the field come to see what God does for us. The child whose birth we honor today calls our attention to the defenseless love of God, who with humility and kindness comes into our world, not to conquer from the outside with might, but to win over our hearts, transforming us from within. In the child Jesus, we clearly see the transformative power of one who is vulnerable and defenseless, yet has the power to draw those who are close but yet still distant toward the love of God. In a beautiful reflection that he wrote when he was still the Archbishop of Munich, Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI said this: "If anything can conquer the arrogance, the violence, and the greed of man, it is the utter vulnerability of a child, and God has taken on this vulnerability." In a talk that he gave this week, Pope Francis spoke about humility as the most important takeaway that we can have from the Christmas experience. He said Jesus teaches us to look upon our poverty with the same love and tenderness with which we look upon a little child, vulnerable and in need of everything. Jesus, who came into the world by the path of humility, has opened a way for us. He indicates a way and shows us a goal. Dear brothers and sisters, without humility we cannot encounter God and experience salvation. It is equally true that without humility we cannot even encounter our neighbors, our brothers and sisters next door. For the shepherds, it was the defenseless child. For the man who wrote the letter, it was the homeless woman. What humbling experience will bring each of us shepherds, who are close yet still distant, to a deeper faith and a more purposeful life? Perhaps it'll be the unborn child whose parents debate the termination of that life. Maybe it'll be the migrant refugee fleeing from violence and poverty and separated from family and country. Maybe it'll be our encounter with a victim of abuse and violence. Maybe it's coming to know the young and the old who are living in shelters or inadequate housing, longing for a safe home and life-sustaining health care. Maybe we'll encounter this vulnerable Christ in an addict or those who suffer because of those addictions. Maybe it's through a young person who is overcome with anxiety and depression, struggling with their identity, and even the desire to live another day. Maybe we'll encounter that humbling presence in the elderly, the infirmed, those suffering from dementia, and all those who care for them. Maybe perhaps we'll find that in looking in on our children and our grandchildren at night, we might see the vulnerable and defenseless Christ child drawing us near. In that letter that we heard from St. Paul to Titus, St. Paul wrote, "The grace of God has appeared, saving all and training us to reject godless ways and worldly desires and to live temperately, justly, and devoutly in this age." That is what happens when we have encounters with the humble and the meek. We reject our godless ways and our worldly desires and live temperately, justly, and devoutly. My brothers and sisters, there are shepherds here. And like the shepherds, we are summoned here this Christmas night. And then we're sent forth to return to the fields, glorifying and praising God for all we have heard and seen. It's an encounter with Christ in the child and in the vulnerable, which prompts us to regain our compassion and no longer be distant, but humbly close to Him, to desire that humility for ourselves and long for the salvation that comes, that has come and awaits us still. Tonight there are shepherds here who will go forth from this Christmas celebration and praise God for all we have heard and seen. Merry Christmas.